Okay, hello and welcome to the fourth episode of the Community Health and Capital podcast series that we're developing and delivering to help the delivery of the 19 Hills Wellbeing Centre in Newport. Today I've got Austin O'Carroll with me. Hi, Austin.
Hi, Johnny. Nice to see you.
Nice to see you too, Austin. Thanks for coming along. Austin is a GP across the water in Dublin. He's got a long-time experience in primary care and health inequalities. And yeah, so we're here to invite people, as I said, to talk about different approaches to prevention, primary care, service collaboration. Why don't you introduce yourself and tell us a bit about yourself first?
Okay, just to introduce, maybe I'll give you the best way to introduce myself is to give you my story of when I first started. I first started in inner city practice in 1997. It was an old Georgian building, real area deprivation. Quite a shock coming into it actually for me, because I had worked in the inner city when I was a young person with children, just before the heroin epidemic came into Dublin. And then I had sort of disappeared. And when I came along, I came into this community where there was a huge amount of, there was a huge disease burden. There was a huge amount of young death.
Wow.
I had a lot of people, families who'd lost 3 or 4 kids to drug addiction. I was going to a funeral once every month.
Wow.
And I was coming into an area where there was huge pressure on us to manage drug addiction with very few resources, as well as the whole effects of poverty on top of that. So it was quite a baptism of fire. Anyway, I set up the practice in 1997, and it was myself and one receptionist. And we gradually grew, and we eventually hired other doctors. And as a lot of the people I worked with, in fact, around the late 90s, there was a flood of migrants came into Ireland and through asylum seeking processes. And next thing, they couldn't get doctors to work with them. And there was a lot as is normal. Because property is cheap in areas of deprivation, that's where they get the accommodation for them. So suddenly they needed to have a service. So I got into developing services for migrants and asylum seekers. And then because we had done that, we also discovered there was a large homeless population in our area. And it's funny, I know in the UK, homeless services and GP services tend to be separated. Whereas interestingly, I query whether that's the right way to go about it, because for me, homelessness is just the far end of poverty. So I'd often see patients in my own practice, and next thing they disappear. And I've since started homeless practices, and I'll meet them in the homeless practice the following week, and I say, "What are you doing here?" And they say, "Oh, I had a row with my mom." And then I'll be in homelessness for a number of months, and suddenly they'll disappear from homelessness and end up back in my practice. So what happened was, because we had to develop service for migrants, they asked me to develop services for homeless people. So we started to develop. I started with one clinic and one nurse, and but then homelessness was really rapidly expanding in Dublin. So then I started to develop other clinics, and I recruited other doctors. And then I realized with all these clinics with different doctors, and a homeless person could go into one clinic, get medication, go into another clinic the next day and get different medication. So then we set up Safety Net, which is an organization that coordinates. So now we have a common database for anyone who goes into any clinic around Ireland, actually.
Wow.
So you can go to a clinic in one place and we'll see that you got that medication. But also that then allowed us to develop systems of following chronic care. So we could see that your blood pressure was done 2 weeks ago and it was raised, and you need to get it repeated. And maybe you need medication change, you need blood tests followed up. So suddenly you start to develop all these possibilities. Anyway, it was from there on, I was still running my practice in Mountjoy Street. And then at the same time, developing these homeless services, and they just grew exponentially because homelessness grew exponentially. So now we have we have Safety Net does inreach into around 10 different homeless hostels. We've around 4 different drop-in centres. We have a methadone treatment service that has over 500 people on it. We have a mobile outreach unit that goes out to homeless people on the streets. We have mobile health and screening service that does X-ray screening, bloodborne virus screening. We run 2 stabilisation centres, a detox centre. We also run a HIV stabilisation unit, a step-up, step-down service, and we also developed extra services for migrants. So all this was happening, but at the same time, I was also running the GP practice. Now, I suppose the last bit of the puzzle was that, we were finding it difficult to recruit GPs into both the services for the homelessness as well as our own practice. And there's no GP training service in North Dublin, even though it's a huge area of deprivation. In our leafy south side, where there's much less deprivation, there's 3 GP training schemes. So then I developed a GP training scheme in 2009 to train GPs to work in areas of deprivation with marginalisation. And that was hugely successful. Almost all our graduates end up working in deprivation or with marginalisation. And in fact, we have a second one opening here. And I think after we started, the Glasgow Pioneers started, and then the Trailblazers started, and then the HEFT program started in the UK. So now across Ireland and UK, there's a large number of GPs who are specifically training to work in areas of deprivation. And interestingly, just to fit home thing is, now we've no problems recruiting GPs in our practice or in the homeless services. So actually, and I was in Manchester recently where a similar scheme was opened up by Laura Nielsen, and she said that they had difficulties recruiting GPs, but now they don't in their area of deprivation. So it sort of completed the puzzle
Really
of
interesting.
providing healthcare to areas of deprivation in North Dublin.
Because obviously we're
Sorry.
keen to develop the service model, but I think there's a lot to do about kind of teaching something different really there. So I'll definitely round and come back to that. You've obviously thrown yourself a lot about all these services and what you've set up and expanded. Where does that passion come from, Austin?
I suppose just to give you a little bit of background, I have thalidomide. I don't know, my mother took thalidomide, and I have shortened limbs and significant disabilities. And I got involved in the disability movement, rights movement. I even go back further. In the 1980s, my family would have been very much involved in charities. And when I got into college, even though I'm agnostic, I joined the Vincent de Paul. And I always say I had 2 educations, one inside the leafy glades within the walls of Trinity College. And then outside that walls was the thriving, human debris, to be honest, of deprivation. And very interesting. So I actually got involved in providing youth services all around inner city Dublin.
Mm-hmm.
I ended up working my summers in playgrounds in the inner city Dublin. And then I discovered that it was really interesting that, people who were living in their 60s and 70s in the community that Trinity College was based had never been in Trinity College. The only people from the community who ever went into Trinity were the cleaners. So I developed very much a charitable ethos there.
Yeah.
However, then when I got later on in the 90s, I got involved in the rights movement, and that made me realize that even though I have great respect for people who are involved in charity is actually ultimately about disempowering the individual, the concept. And I learned a more human rights approach. So when I actually got to start the practice in Mountjoy Street, I suppose I'll give you a story. I inherited a huge problem with benzodiazepines. And I had people who were on so it's up to 60 milligrams of diazepam a week, and some massive amounts. It's on a week a day. So I basically had to reduce all this down. And that meant that, I was having a lot of arguments. And I remember, ironically, that I ended up taking diazepam at the end of the weekends. I was so stressed out. But I sort of decided that I wanted to manage this and bring them off, but in a way that would not lose them, because I believed that they had a right to healthcare. So I took a decision early on that my mission was to address the effects of health inequality. And that actually, ever since then, I'm a big believer in vision. Vision is the way you see you would like the world to be, and the mission is what you're going to do to try and achieve that. So I sort of developed a vision and mission with my then single administrator, our receptionist, and the 2 of us, and she had a similar ethos, to be fair, as well. And therefore, we managed to get them all off the benzodiazepines and actually maintain them all as patients as well. Now, some of them left because they got other doctors who would give them, but we didn't put them off the list. So we've always held that ethos. And then I think in later years, the concept of trauma-informed care has sort of neatly fitted in. It's given the language to the way I instinctively was going from a rights-based approach. So I'm a big fan of trauma-informed care. So trauma-informed care is a way of understanding how people behave, and it allows us to ensure that those people who are most on the margins have their right to healthcare maintained and fulfilled.
It can really help, I think, help people understand the different ways people behave, really, can't it, really? Because I think we can take quite an antagonistic approach to when people are acting a certain way, presenting in a certain way, but there's a huge background to it to keep the relationship going, isn't there?
I find it just instinctively, I mean, you understanding the whole impact of childhood adversity is really, from a cognitive point of view, is fantastic. It gives you a language and it gives you the statistical understanding. But the simple intuitive understanding is that if I see someone in my waiting room, so for example, there's a while back there was a young couple coming in for a benzodiazepine detox. We do those, and this was in my homeless service, and their child was in the waiting room, and the child started to do something, and the father said, "Oh, stop doing that." And someone else in the waiting room said, "Ah, he's doing no harm, leave him alone." And the father just lost it. He absolutely lost it. He went tearing for the other guy. And two of my staff managed to hold him back, managed to put him outside. He kicked in the door. He assaulted someone on the pavement. He then went across the pavement, assaulted someone else, and then the guards picked him up and brought him in. Now, when I look at that guy, I see a child having a tantrum, who's never learned the skills to manage that. And probably when he had tantrums as a child, was reacted to with violence and aggression. So that's my intuitive understanding. And I was really delighted because my staff came back to me, and we've trained them up in trauma-informed care. And they came into me one day, and like I was saying, I'm not bringing him back, I can't expose him to the staff. But the staff came in and said, actually, we think we can deal with him. So we brought him in after the surgery was closed, and we actually completed his benzo detox. And in fact, by the end, he was fine, and he'd come in during the day, and he knew that he couldn't act like that again. So
that's really interesting. So, what are some of the things that you've led the staff to learn in that trauma-informed training?
I think, you see, what I think is that I've got local staff, a lot of them from the area. So a lot of them have sympathy for these people because these are people from their own area. So I think they had an intuitive understanding themselves. And again, when you give them to me, you're never trauma informed. It's a process. It's not a state. It's a process of constantly being aware. So we do training on trauma informed and give them the data on the impact of childhood adversity. And then we talk about how we manage people who are going to have challenging behaviors in a way, because they're the ones who are most likely to end up dead young, because they're the ones who end up. We see, for example, drug addiction as a self-treatment for the impact of trauma. Irving Welch, the guy who wrote Trainspotting, I was listening to him on the radio recently, and he said something really interesting. He was saying that he used to use heroin, and the interviewer said to him, "You got off heroin?" And Irving said, "Oh yeah." He said, "I got off heroin." He said, "But I just used heroin for fun." He said, "It's easy to get off heroin." He says, "The people who stay on heroin," he says, "they're the ones who are using it to treat whatever happened to them as kids." And that's the way we see drug addiction is it's a self-managing of trauma. So the people who are most chaotic are the ones most likely to drug use and most likely to die young. So, and I also think there's this thing about if you have a vision and mission, it actually motivates you and keeps your passion. Burnout is such an issue in general practice, and I'm not saying I go through periods where I feel burnt out, and the good thing is, I think a key issue is knowing to recognize when you're burnt out. So I go in some days, and I know how to go through the motions and say, "Oh God, that's terrible," and "How are you?" and "That's awful." So I can look empathic, but I don't really give a damn on those days. And I think you get away with that for so long, but patients eventually cop on if you stay in that. So when you learn to recognize it, you take action. And then in general, I go in and I do feel the empathy and I feel the sorrow with them and the happiness. So, but I think a big part of keeping that empathy and that avoiding burnout is having a clear vision and mission. You're clearly what you're doing to help people. And I have found that hugely powerful in helping me going in my life.
So thinking through all of the work that you've done before and where your passion lies, Austin, if you were to kind of have a role in shaping what we could do with our centre, 16, 20,000 people in the area, what are some of the kind of principles or approaches you might take?
Well, I think the first thing is, and it sounds obviously like you're there, is obviously to have a clear vision and mission in what you're doing. And
Hmm.
I think it's to get all the staff, and when I write down to the cleaners, get them involved in that vision and mission,
Hmm.
because I think, so for example, the management of challenging behaviors, for example, is key, that the reception staff know how to do that, and they have to buy into the model. I think that's the first thing I would do. Um,
Is
I
that
think
something you found easy with staff over the years?
I think it's a question of part of its recruitment. And
Hmm.
I do think it doesn't have to be local staff, but having a lot of staff or staff from a background in those areas, it does help.
Hmm.
Um, but it doesn't have to be that. I think that's part of it. But then I think the training is, so. Yeah, if you have someone who is, it's recruitment. So when you're recruiting someone, I'm looking for someone who has a passion, or who I think has a leaning towards that.
Hmm.
So, and there's times you get someone who doesn't feel with that, and eventually it's a bad fit, and it's about working together for you both to realize it doesn't fit and move them
Hmm.
on. So
Hmm.
I do think getting the right team is key.
Hmm.
And if someone
Hmm.
doesn't fit into the team, I think you need to be a bit ruthless
Hmm.
and
Hmm.
say, because you can end up wasting their time, because they get frustrated because they're involved in something that really doesn't feel right to them.
Yeah.
So I think that's the first thing. And then, so yeah, and then the training. Once you have the right team, then it's about the training, and it's about rewarding them. And when you manage a person really well, it's about saying that was really good.
Hmm.
And we go out and celebrate often, and every time we have achievements, we follow our figures, and we feed that back, and we celebrate a lot. So we do a lot of celebrating, which is great fun.
Yeah.
And
Teams in primary care don't often come together enough to do that, really, do they? The job's so busy, everybody's looking to clock off. Everybody is quite burnt out, really, aren't they? It can be quite lonely as well.
I think so, and I think those celebrations are key in developing and maintaining your vision and mission.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
because you realize that when you celebrate together, it actually bonds you together.
Hmm. Hmm.
And also, I think it makes you feel appreciated. And
Hmm.
I do think, if I was to be fair, I'd say my staff would say they feel appreciated
Hmm.
by the work by my management. And so I think that's key. And then in other things is, I do think, when you're running a practice, the key issue is about having systems that allow you run. So, appointment systems, admin systems. But then I think in an area of deprivation, and I suppose this is particularly obviously for homeless people, is
Hmm.
they don't fit into systems.
Hmm.
And I
Hmm.
think, like I originally did research, ethnographic research, into why homeless people don't use health services. And I concluded it's because health services are designed for non-homeless people.
Hmm.
So homeless people, ideally it's drop-in clinics. And in areas of deprivation, there's a lot to be said for some period of
Far
drop-in.
more flexibility.
Yeah, so I think
Yeah.
it's about getting that flexibility. And so you want a system that helps us, helps you run properly, but you
Hmm.
need flexibility as well.
Hmm.
Um, I mean, in Ireland, I think it's different in England. I think specialised services are separated away from
Hmm.
primary care, which I think
Hmm.
is a slight pity. In
Hmm.
Ireland, we have this connection still that a lot of the services are run by primary care centres and primary care services. And I think that connection is really useful, because we'll often transfer patients from our homeless practice into our primary care practice. Um, but if you are developing services for those groups of people, I do think as they tend to keep away
Yeah.
um, from the mainstream services. Very interesting, simple things like some homeless people know that they smell or look different, and they feel embarrassed.
Hmm.
They're not comfortable in that space. I apologize, I do loads of stories, but like I remember I was doing my research, and I was in an emergency department in a hospital, and everybody was waiting for ages, but they were all chatting. And at the back, suddenly I saw the door open. In came these two people, and they were obviously either drug users or homeless. And the whole room went silent. And the two drug users at home started talking very aggressively and angrily. And they sort of crept around the side of the wall. And then they went into the toilet, and everybody sort of relaxed. And then they came out again. Everybody tensed up again and went silent. And they crawled and they talked loudly. And then they went out. When they went out, everybody relaxed. So I followed the two lads out the back and went down and found them sitting with four others. And they're all drinking. And it was like being at a party. It was great crack. We're all sharing stories. And I realized that we have two different spaces.
Hmm.
The homeless people, stroke drug users were comfortable in the space on the steps outside and
Mm-hmm.
uncomfortable. And the way they expressed their discomfort was to talk aggressively.
Mm.
Mainstream people. So that's why I do think, and I don't like the term specialized services because it sounds like we're making a special effort for them.
Mm-hmm.
It's
Mm-hmm.
not, it's just developing services that are suitable for that population.
Mm-hmm.
So just the same way as we develop primary care centres to be suitable for the housed population.
Yeah.
So I think if you need to get to those service communities, you need to develop that type of service that does more outreach and gets
Yeah.
out.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. And you've obviously had a lot of success with the teaching and training side. What are some of the kind of unique things that you think staff or GPs need to know working in the areas or the patient groups that we're talking about?
First thing I need to tell you is the motivation. That was really interesting. When I first started, everyone said to me, don't call it a GP training scheme to train GPs to recognise deprivation and marginalisation. And I said, why? Is it too long? And they said, no. They said, no one will apply. And we have had probably the highest rate of application since we started.
Wow. Okay.
And I'd love to say it's that we're fantastic, but I think it's that young people actually do want to make a difference. It's just you need to provide them the opportunity. So that was the first thing. And actually, the first thing is just getting that group of people together. Second thing is you have to train them as high quality GPs. You want high quality GPs in your area of deprivation. So, that's not for negotiation. They have to get the same quality of training as everyone else. What we do on top of that is we do a social medicine module. So we teach them in health inequalities, but we also teach them about working with marginalization, trauma-informed care, etc. We also do an arts-based program, and this I think is about, interestingly, it's much more valuable than people realize. The reason I use the arts-based is, the way you can sit a group of doctors down and we can sit and talk about real life cases that are really sad and in a case conference and discuss it, and we're fine. That night we'll go to a fictional film and we'll be all crying in the aisles. And what is it? I mean, it's probably a good thing that we're not crying at these meetings.
Yeah, to an extent. Yeah.
An educational point of view, it's good to be able to access those feelings and work with them, because they're the feelings that keep you motivated and going. And so we go to a lot of plays. Like we read a play last week, which was set in the inner city, about the 1918 flu pandemic and its effect on our local Rotunda hospital. And we got the theatre director to come out and talk to us. We go to art galleries where there's exhibitions. So it's relevant to social medicine, but it's a night out. It's actually great fun. You go for a pint after. But it allows you to explore these ideas. And I suppose what I'm trying to get people to understand is that general practice is much richer than just biomedicine. And you can learn about it from all aspects. You can learn about it from books. You can learn about it from theatre, from film. And from a social medicine point of view, obviously, you're exploring aspects, other than the cognitive. You're exploring the impact of the emotional impact when you go to theatre. So we do an arts-based program. We do a change management program because we want them to change the world. And in their fourth year, they spend 4 months for a day a week working in homeless services, 4 months for a day a week working in drug services, and 4 months for a day a week working in prisons in the morning and migrant service in the afternoon. Now, we have other components. We have a self-care module as well, which we do mindfulness-based stress reduction. We teach them yoga, and we talk about how we manage self-care. And again, we celebrate again, and that's partly to model that we enjoy celebrating, we enjoy. So these are all the things. We also we do theatre of the oppressed on the thing. So we do other different things. So
I wish I'd had a chance to go on it. Looking back at it now, it's the time to get people, really, isn't it? If you can engage somebody at that point of their career when they're still forming their ideas and direction, the opportunities to reorient it to a different direction is huge and transformative, isn't it?
I think that's the thing. Is it's really interesting. It's about you're mixing your normal everyday teaching, knowledge-based teaching with transformative learning, because I think that's what it is. You're trying to transform their worldview, and it's interesting. I was only talking to a trainee last week saying she says, I want more work, sessions on liver function tests and cardiac stuff. And I understand her. She's very pragmatic and she's a brilliant doctor, and she's very devoted to the things, the scheme. Where sometimes we do more transformative type stuff, and some people, different people react to it in different ways. But I think in general we've good responses to it.
I mean, just imagine if, the state of training across a whole country was similar schemes, maybe not always tailored to specific services such as homelessness, really, but to kind of teach primary care with that mindset would be massive, really, wouldn't it?
Well, see, I think it's interesting. I think the sort of the way they developed GP training is it's sort of done on, oh, we're producing doctors that can work anywhere.
Yeah.
What I've always said is you need a national curriculum which meets the needs of, the high quality doctors, but you need to develop a local curriculum that addresses the local needs of the community. So it doesn't matter if it's a well-off community, there are local needs there. And, by teaching people to address them that locally, so that means people who are going to stay in those areas, and most people stay in the area they're trained in, are more geared up to working in that area. And again, going back to that idea, I think medicine has become way too biomedical, and so as to use those other methods to try and understand, go back to the rich concept of general practice, where we're rooted in a community, a member of a community, and we helped people through illness. They didn't necessarily have to have disease. They might have just come in with symptoms that we couldn't find a cause for. Loneliness, we don't have to classify loneliness as depression to help them. So as to give a much richer idea of what we do as GPs.
And get into the social realm. I just wondered, Austin, you said you'd learned so much from the disability movement and that kind of empowerment agenda. We're not always good in healthcare or the NHS, at least in Wales and England, in terms of inviting people in to kind of really challenges, whether it be from patient participation groups or to any other kind of way. How do you see us doing that different and involving local people in what it is that we're doing?
Well, I'm a big fan of local involvement. I think it's really key. And also, I think it's a key to get peer workers working. So we're developing peer working programs in our homeless services. In terms of, for example, in training, in terms of disability rights, like the social medicine, the model of medicine is such a challenge to the medical model. And that transformed the way I see the world. So the social model is basically saying is that, the medical model of disability is that there's a problem with the person. So, they have an impairment, and that's, we have to give them medical services. So a person in a wheelchair needs medical services. The social model says the person in a wheelchair needs to get buildings that don't have steps in them, and needs to get employment opportunities, and needs to get training, and not rehab. They need training in a normal college, and to get all the barriers that prevent them participation in society. And that social model has transformed. So, for example, people with disabilities now will not go into nursing homes where nurses control their lives. They recruit their own personal assistants and train them in how to help them be independent. And that may include nursing duties, but it may include bringing them to the pub or to their work. So I totally agree with you. We need to bring in these other concepts on community development, disability rights, social medicine model, travelers' rights, other cultures, because they can challenge our biomedical paradigm. Don't get me wrong, I'm not anti-biomedicine. It's hugely important. I think we have over time developed a restrictive worldview, restricted to biomedicine, and
a steep hierarchy with it, really, isn't there? I think really that is quite impervious to challenge. Okay. Well, Austin, it's been an absolute inspiration talking to you. I think it's really noble and laudable what you've developed over there over the years. And thank you so much for sharing it with us today. This was the 4th episode of Community Health and Capital podcast. If you've got any ideas for future podcasts, let us know. Thanks to Austin for joining, and we look forward to coming together with an interview in the weeks to come.
Thanks very much.